The freezing waters of the Vistula River churn with the weight of 100,000 Soviet soldiers. It is September 14, 1930, and the night air is thick with the sulfur of heavy artillery. Across the river, the spires of Warsaw burn against a bruised sky, while overhead, the desperate hum of British-made biplanes signals that Western Europe has finally entered the fight. But the Red Army isn't stopping. They aren't fighting a defensive war, they are marching west to set the entire continent on fire. At the center of this storm is one man, Leon Trotsky. If history had gone just slightly differently, the man leading the Soviet Union wouldn't have been Joseph Stalin. It would have been Trotsky, the fiery intellectual who believed that the communist revolution could never survive in Russia alone. It had to be exported. It had to be global. And it had to be forced by bayonet. But would Trotsky's vision of a permanent revolution have forged a colossal socialist superpower spanning from Vladivostok to Paris? Or would his aggressive crusade have united the capitalist world to crush the Soviet Union before it could even begin? Rewind. To understand how we reached this burning riverbank, we have to go back to a quiet, suffocating room in Moscow, where a dying leader's final warning was about to be ignored. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Lenin suffered his fourth and final stroke. He left behind a fragile, bleeding nation. The Russian Civil War had ended just 3 years prior, leaving 7 million people dead, cities in ruins, and a population starving. The young Soviet state was a pariah on the global stage, surrounded by hostile capitalist nations who wanted nothing more than to see the Bolshevik experiment fail. The Bolsheviks stood at a terrifying crossroads. They had to choose between two fundamentally different paths to survival. On one side stood Joseph Stalin, the quiet bureaucrat who proposed socialism in one country. His idea was simple: build a fortress. Focus inward, industrialize Russia by force, and secure the state before worrying about the rest of the world. On the other side was Leon Trotsky, the brilliant orator who had built the Red Army of 5 million men from scratch. Trotsky argued that Stalin's plan was a death sentence. He believed that a lone socialist state would eventually be choked out by the global capitalist economy. The only solution, in his eyes, was permanent revolution. Russia had to act as a spark to ignite workers' rebellions in Germany, France, and Britain. If you were a starving Russian peasant in 1924, which path would you have chosen? The slow, grueling rebuild of Stalin's fortress, or Trotsky's high-stakes gamble on a global workers' paradise? Let me know in the comments below. In our timeline, Stalin won this duel of ideas through ruthless political maneuvering, eventually exiling Trotsky. But Trotsky's defeat was not inevitable. In fact, it hung on a single, highly calculated lie. In January 1924, Trotsky was recovering from an illness in the warm southern city of Sukhum, over 1,000 miles away from Moscow. When Lenin died, Stalin sent Trotsky a telegram with the wrong date for the funeral, convincing him there was no time to make it back. Trotsky missed the funeral. The public was outraged by his apparent disrespect, while Stalin stood prominently by Lenin's coffin, cementing himself as the natural heir. But what if Trotsky's train had run on time? Imagine January 26, 1924. The steam locomotive screeches to a halt at the Moscow station into a freezing -15 degrees. Trotsky steps off the train. He does not miss the funeral. Instead, he delivers a soaring, emotional eulogy that reminds the nation of his status as Lenin's right-hand man. When the 13th Party Congress meets later that spring, Trotsky is not sidelined. Armed with Lenin's actual last testament, which explicitly warned the party to remove Stalin from power, Trotsky strikes first. With the absolute loyalty of the Red Army behind him, Trotsky has Stalin arrested for treason. The bureaucrat is gone. The firebrand is in control. At first, there is a wave of hope. Trotsky promises an end to the rising bureaucratic dictatorship. But that hope quickly turns to dread as his true plans emerge. Trotsky doesn't want peace. By 1927, he institutes the militarization of labor. Entire factories are run like army divisions. Grain is seized from the peasants at gunpoint, even more aggressively than in our timeline, to feed a standing army that Trotsky swells to 6 million men by 1928. And then, the perfect opportunity arrives. Across the border, Germany's Weimar Republic begins to fracture under the weight of hyperinflation, with millions of angry, unemployed workers taking to the streets. To Trotsky, this is the spark he has been waiting for. He issues a secret directive to the Red Army: prepare to march. But as the Soviet war machine begins to roll toward the Polish border, the Western powers realize they are facing a threat far more aggressive than they ever anticipated. But here is where the grand illusion of Trotsky's dream utterly shatters. For years, Trotsky believed that the working classes of Europe would rise up in rebellion the moment they saw the Red Army's banners crossing their borders. He assumed the capitalist powers were too divided, too weak from the aftermath of the First World War, to mount any kind of coordinated defense. And then, the exact opposite happened. Instead of fracturing, Trotsky's aggressive posturing did the unthinkable: it united his enemies in a panic. In May 1929, terrified by the massing of 6 million Soviet troops on their borders, Britain, France, and a fragile German government signed a secret military alliance. The British poured £50 million into rebuilding the Polish military, while the French deployed over 400 modern fighter planes to tactical airfields along the Vistula River. But wait until you see what happens when Trotsky's own generals realize the sheer madness of his plan: a sudden, bloody betrayal in the Kremlin that will decide the fate of Russia. Do you think a highly mobilized but starving Red Army could have defeated a united European coalition, or was Trotsky's global crusade always a suicide mission? Tell me your theories in the comments below. With the international trap set, Trotsky ignores his advisors and orders the invasion. In May 1930, the Red Army crosses the Polish border. But this is no longer the chaotic war of 1920. They are marching straight into a highly organized, heavily armed meat grinder. By August 1930, the Soviet offensive seems unstoppable. The Red Army pushes deep into Poland, driving 300 miles in just 6 weeks. Trotsky's propaganda machine proclaims that the fall of Warsaw will trigger a communist revolution across the globe. On September 10, Soviet forces launch a massive assault on the Polish capital, deploying over 600 T-18 tanks in a thunderous display of mechanized power. And it works. The Polish defensive lines buckle. On September 12, the red flag is raised over the ruins of Warsaw's central square. It is a moment of pure, blinding triumph. It looks like Trotsky has won, and that Europe is his for the taking. But the celebration lasts less than 24 hours. On September 13, the British Royal Navy blocks the Baltic Sea, while a joint Anglo-French force of 150,000 elite troops lands behind Soviet lines at Danzig. At the exact same moment, the consequences of Trotsky's domestic brutality explode. Back in Russia, over 3 million starving peasants, pushed to the brink by violent grain seizures, launch a massive, coordinated rebellion. They seized the rail lines, cutting off 90% of the ammunition flowing to the front. Suddenly, the victorious Red Army is stranded, starving, and completely out of bullets. This brings us back to that freezing night on September 14, 1930. Now we see the truth of the Vistula River. The 100,000 Soviet soldiers churning the freezing waters aren't marching west to conquer Europe. They are running. They are fleeing eastward in a desperate, chaotic retreat, trying to cross back over the river before the British biplanes and Allied armored cars cut them to pieces. The burning spires of Warsaw aren't a monument to Soviet victory, they are the funeral pyre of Trotsky's entire life's work. Within weeks, the Soviet front collapses entirely. In 1931, a coalition of weary Red Army generals, led by Mikhail Tukhachevsky, launches a coup in Moscow, arresting Trotsky and signing a humiliating peace treaty that strips Russia of Ukraine and Belarus. The Soviet Union is broken, partitioned, and reduced to a starving, landlocked rump state. Trotsky's permanent revolution didn't build a global communist utopia. By refusing to build a fortress first, he left the young Soviet state completely vulnerable, burning it down before it ever had a chance to grow. The dream of the global workers' paradise died in the mud of the Vistula, leaving a fractured, hyper-militarized Europe bracing for an even darker century. If you want to see how the world would look if the Russian Empire had never fallen in the first place, click on the video on your screen right now.